Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this very special session, Creating Change. You have a very fabulous panel here. And creating change not for the sake of change, creating change for a better economic growth, better civil society, better informed society, better education, a healthier environment, more jobs, a society that has access for information, to education, to status, and to wealth. I said I have a very special team of panelists around me, and I'm going only to tell you their names, and later on, I'm going to ask each one to speak about their real life story when they created change, and to tell us also about the most difficult challenges they faced when they were making that change. And after that, we can put the question to the audience, because I know we are running out of time, and I don't want you to miss on your lunch. I'm sure most of you are already hungry. But to tell you who are they, I've got Dr. Uygar Özesmi, all the way from Turkey. Jason Clark is the founder of Minds at Work. Caroline Curtis is the CEO of the Australian Centre for Social Innovation. And Adi Birch is the CEO of the Global Foundation. My name is Joseph Asaf, and I'm the chairman and the founder of the Ethnic Business Awards. I'm also a member of the C20 steering committee. I am a typical migrant of the 60s and 70s. I landed in Australia with no money, no language, no family, and I started working in a factory. I always wanted to learn English. It took me 3 months before I realized which one of the languages was English, because no one in the factory spoke English. That was my first inspiration to start a change. Not only I decided to communicate with all the workers in the factory, but I looked at the statistics, and there were at the time, and the figure is even higher now, 20% of the population of Australia over the age of 5 were speaking language other than English at home. I went and studied and taught myself the language and started Australia, if not the world's first multicultural communication agency, specializing in communicating with people who are of diverse linguistic background, cultural, religious. And that company put me in face of a lot of challenges. And I worked on almost every issue for the first 10, 15 years until the whole multicultural communication became an industry. Many other companies started doing what I was doing. But by then also, I ended up joining forces with the world's largest group of communication, WPP. And I sold the company. What I learned, a lot of things, but one most important thing, I learned how to make people aware of everything that's going around them. Because if you want to have a good management of diversity, you have to give equal access to education, to information, to jobs, and that worked very well. At the same time, I saw that 25% of all businesses in Australia were owned and operated by people whose first language was not English. 25%, a quarter of all businesses in Australia. In fact, the figure now is 31% of all businesses in Australia are owned by people who were born outside Australia. Because of that, I created the Ethnic Business Awards, and I think I'm here because of the Ethnic Business Awards. The Ethnic Business Award is the longest running award, business award in Australia, 26 years. I have seen so much changes, so much economic growth being achieved, so much more jobs created. Because the first thing, why that figure is so high amongst the non-English speakers, amongst migrants, because they couldn't get a job, they couldn't speak the language. This is why you find, amongst all the people who nominated for the awards, almost 40% were women. So to me, people think women were vulnerable. I think they had more advantage. Lucky they did not get a job because they couldn't speak English, because they ended up setting up their own businesses. And many of them now are running multinational businesses because of their lack of knowing the language. Now, it's the same thing about the males when they also went to be self-employed. They ended up being so successful, not only in creating jobs or creating economic growth, but also, if you look at the remittance, how much remittance they generate to their countries. If you look at the charity they do around the world, their contribution to the community, to absolutely everything. Some of the people here, and I know Tim Costello has witnessed one of the session last year, the 25th anniversary of the Ethnic Business Award was held in the Parliament House in Canberra. And we looked at the 100 finalists, the turnover of 100 finalists after 25 years, but only for 1 year. And the accumulated turnover for 1 year was $100 billion. Sorry, $6 billion. So we took the average and multiplied it by all the people who applied for the awards over the last 25 years. We ended up having a figure of $960 billion. That is big. And when we looked at each individual, we saw how much they were contributing, each in their own right, to the society, to the community, to business, not only locally, but internationally, because they happen to come from 102 countries around the world. And this is our greatest asset in being a very strong global civil society, if you look at each one independently. I think I've given you my story. Now I would like you to listen to the most fascinating stories of each one of the members of the panel. And let me begin with Dr. Uygar Özesmi from Turkey.
Thank you very much, Joseph. For most of my life, I used to be an environmentalist. So I worked in environmental issues, biodiversity conservation, climate change. But what I realized, trying to solve the problems, the environmental problems, in my working with Tema Foundation, which is the largest environmental NGO in Turkey, and then working later with Greenpeace, was that the root cause of all of it was essentially what we could call the dominant socioeconomic paradigm. And even in our communique that we are discussing right now, we are re-ingraining, entrenching the same notion of the dominant socioeconomic paradigm. Because when you look at what the real problem is with environmental issues, it's growth itself. Donella Meadows, in her famous work with the Club of Rome, has said that if there is one leverage point, if you wanted to fix in the economy or in the environmental issues, it would be growth. You would have to take growth out of this notion. Yet here in our work, we are working with growth because that is what talks to the ones in power. Because what we see in society is there are large interest groups with consolidated power, and they will drive the agenda. And because they are driving the agenda, we are trying to sort of maneuver that larger interest groups political agendas and exerting our power to shift that towards what we could call a sustainable society. So therefore, the biggest change in my life was I stopped being an environmentalist and I said the way we can really do change is through tackling all of these integrated issues related to economy, to justice, to everything that people think is important. And therefore, I made a change to change.org. Right now, I work for change.org. And here at change.org now, I am trying to help people, anyone, from wherever they are and whatever opinion that they have, to enable them to start a petition on their cause, address it to the ones in power, to the decision makers, and try to convince them to make the change that they believe in through creating a community, an organized force of civil society that comes together with regards to one single issue at a time. Because if we want to tackle something as big as the dominant socioeconomic paradigm, you better start chipping at it, at this big monolith, because we can't really lift that one big stone. And to the other side, what we need to do is take little pieces of it through people power and create the society that we want to live in, both in the environment and all the other social justice issues. And that's my story of changing.
Thank you, Iga. Jason.
I want the film rights to that story. My story is a bit simpler. The first 15 years of my life was probably taken up with the entertainment industry and advertising. So I'm all better now, but that's what I did for the first part of my life. And I found it was very easy to change people's behaviours because it was very easy to distract them from the things that mattered. And it's very, very easy to make them want things. And I was very, very good at that. And then someone gave me a David Suzuki lecture on tape and it destroyed my life. Because I basically realised I was devoting my creativity and my intelligence and my energy to really making the world worse. So that was the first 15 years, was telling people what to think. The second 15 years, the one that I'm just coming to the end of now, is really showing people how to think. So I went away from the propaganda business and thought, okay, what I'll be interested in is innovation, change, progress, sustainability. So 15 years ago, I started a thing called Minds at Work, and our mantra is we help people think, and the reason why we do that is to make a future that works. So anyone who's interested in that, these are people we work with. About 15% of those would be corporate, that we think are sort of past the smell test, and everyone else is not-for-profits, communities, individuals. It's anyone who gives a damn and just needs to be a bit clear about how to get that thing done. So part 2 of Jace's life was helping people think. About 8 years ago, I co-founded a thing called the Centre for Sustainability Leadership, which has been a fantastic engine to try and fill the leadership vacuum. You look around, the world is being very badly managed. It's not being led. And so we're trying to think where will the leaders come from. I got sick of asking the question. We thought, let's actually start a process. And the idea was that if it's so hard to get people in power to care, let's try getting people who care into power. Turns out that's not difficult. So that's where I am at the moment. And that was the how to think mode. I'm now moving into my next phase, of which I think this is part, is actually telling people what to think about. Because helping people to think actually isn't difficult, and collaboration isn't difficult, but getting people to pay attention to things that matter, that's my next challenge. And so that's my story, and that's why I'm here.
Thank you, Jason. Caroline?
Well, I guess I feel like my career has also been full of extremes. I was brought up in a single-parent household, and poverty, poor mental health, unemployment were all themes of my upbringing. But the one thing that I had was a remarkable mother, and I was part of a fairly rich and astounding community that always wrapped themselves around us during challenging times. But I was always acutely aware that not everyone had access to that. Not everyone had an incredibly resilient mother like mine, or were part of a solid community. So I did what any sensible girl would do and became a social worker to go about changing the world and changing that very issue in itself. But I started in a very interesting place, and I thought I was starting in the right place, and you know, I'm sure it did me well at the time, but I started in child protection. And I spent the first several years of my career removing children from their parents and investigating child abuse and neglect. And I was very much a part of a system that constantly reinforced that we shouldn't trust people, we shouldn't value people, and that people really play no role in the future of their own lives or as part of a solution for more people. I hung around there for quite a while though. I got pulled into the web of bureaucracy and went from frontline through to policy through to executive. And I guess what else I saw was a system that was constantly trying to apply simple solutions to complex problems. I saw a system that was so risk adverse. There was never any space to try, to fail, or to innovate or do anything differently. And I saw a very dedicated group of people that were constantly, before you knew it, mimicking the behaviour of their clients by living in a crisis-driven space rather than ever focusing on outcomes or impact and trying to shift people to a new space. So the opportunity came up, this is almost 12 or so years later, for me to go to this very strange place called TAXI, which stands for the Australian Centre for Social Innovation. And I literally overnight was given an opportunity to turn my entire career on its head. And I became the founding director of a program called Family by Family, which is everything that I hadn't been doing for the last 12 or 15 years, which is valuing the expertise of families that have been through those very issues and that have come out the other side, using them as your resource, mobilising them, employing them to help solve the problems and find the solutions, and then in fact letting them deliver the service. And that's been a remarkable shift for me personally, and I think a really positive step forward for the social sector in this country. Now, I nearly had a nervous breakdown in the process because it was just such a foreign concept to me. But every day, and I very much still, even as the Chief Executive, sit in the work and rest in the work. I think it's really important. So I connect with these families and people every day, and I'm still constantly astounded by the value and the impact that they themselves make. So from there, I was then given an opportunity to run the organisation. And now what we're seeing across a range of different areas such as child protection, ageing, caring, Indigenous communities, disability, we're able to work with these people on the ground in quite a complex way using methods such as co-design and looking at how these people can really drive bigger agendas at a policy and systems level. And that's a phenomenal place for me to find myself in 15 years later, after being the person knocking on the door, taking their kids away and taking them to court and ensuring that they never saw their kids again, or at least till they were 18. So I feel like I've lived at the extremes and definitely feel like I'm headed in the right direction now.
Thank you. Okay, our next is Adi.
Thank you. So my story starts with very similar themes to yours, actually, and that is, I think I became a product of a single parent family, living with a mother who worked very, very hard to make sure that we had a roof over our heads. I think we had somewhat less community support than it sounds like you might have experienced, but it was a hard start to life. We had good family on one side, not so good on the other. So, when I was looking at what kind of person I wanted to be, I think my early development was really built with tones of, working hard and feeling very responsible for the world, and being the oldest of two children as well in a single parent family. For those that have experienced it, you realise you spend a lot of time doing the things that you're not necessarily old enough or experienced enough to really understand. And so in growing up, I was very conscious of being responsible and very conscious of really wanting to make my mother proud and not be a problem or an extra burden for her when I was seeing how hard she was working in trying to provide an environment for us. We were in a fairly challenged socio-economic environment. I wasn't in the best primary school in the world. It was a really tough place to be. But I just knew that there was a way that the system wouldn't necessarily have to define the person. And so for me, working hard and trying to be the best that I could possibly be and trying to push out and try new things and break existing sort of boundaries was really, really important. And so what it meant was that I had an incredible drive, but in learning that sort of ethic of hard work and really trying to please the people that mattered, what I actually established within myself was an enormous level of energy to try and be the best person and to have, as high a level of personal integrity that I could, so that what I was doing wasn't necessarily about me. And so I've approached life in that way and with very much a very strong sense of responsibility about how my little place in the world actually helped to make others' little place in the world that bit better. I've been really fortunate, and I'm one of those people that says thanks every day for how lucky I am, because I think no matter where you are in the world and no matter how hard you are experiencing life, there's always somebody that's actually having a tougher time than you are. And so every morning I've woken up in my life and thought, wow, thank God I'm not dealing with that. And be thankful for the things that are around me. And I think for me, it's given me an enormous blessing of experience. I've been really fortunate to have had an incredible array of both personal and work experiences come my way. Most of the time I don't quite understand how I've got them. They've just, appeared. But and I always feel slightly underqualified and I guess, less capable than I should be in doing them. But I think that piece of humility is really important. And I've been fortunate enough to have played a role through my career in jobs that were very responsible and were very rooted in doing good for the community, but also have the experience to play in roles that were far less serious and gave a much different perspective on how you can engage with the community. And that very consciously being both across the not-for-profit sector, but also in the commercial sector and in very highly commercial roles at times. My journey with the Global Foundation began actually 17 years ago, and I was asked to come in and provide some advice from a commercial perspective on how you might organise the right structure to enable an organisation like this to develop in the way that it was meant to. And so I was very privileged to have had the chance to be involved in that early architecture and sat in and actually supported the organisation for its first 5 years of life. I then went off and did some other things, and I think the greatest privilege that I experienced in all those years was the privilege of becoming a mother. For me, that is the most responsible job in the world and is the thing that then has driven every single day of my life since then. And as much, I think, has opened my mind much more to the longer term impacts of everything that we do in our daily lives and how that is actually leaving the right space for the next generation. And so for me, my life has become very much about how do I actually leave this world in better shape than when I came into it. And so I've been very fortunate in being asked back in to run the foundation as its CEO at the beginning of last year. It's an extraordinary institution. It has been around for 17 years, although most of you wouldn't know about it. It works very quietly, but when I think about the greatest challenge in creating change, the greatest challenge in creating change is actually the only possible solution to creating change, and that is people. And people who can find a way to come together, free of all of those vested interests and boundaries that define us in our daily lives, remembering that we move through multiple roles during our lifetime, and give us enough freedom and enough space to sit and think as citizens about how we can work together to actually create a common language that then can help to actually drive momentum, and momentum that can actually then drive action and outcome in relation to change. So I've learned a lot. I think I'm this way along my journey, but it's certainly for me an extraordinary privilege to experience the human element of change and be part of that citizens' movement that actually will enable change over time. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. Look, because of the time restriction, I'm going to let the audience ask the question. I'm not going to ask the members of the panel any question. Please, Who would like to ask any question? See?
Right, that's it there.
Right. Tell us your name and yeah, it's you.
Hi, my name is Mariano. I am from Oxfam. I am originally from Argentina. So linking this panel to the previous one, right? It seems to be that one of the challenges of civil society, I think, is how not to be relevant and how to bring people together. And I would like to know, I mean, just looking at the websites of all your organizations, it seems to be that you are doing a great work at your communities, right? But thinking about the C20, and I think this sort of gap that we, civil society, usually have on high-level advocacy and how to engage people, I would like to hear a bit more how we actually try to bridge that gap and organizations like yours try to bring people together so that, you know, we can actually, in this powerful, you know, this sort of power game that we are playing against corporate sector interest or at least the elite interest, how we are able to bring people into the equation so that these sort of conversations that we have in the last 2 days are not just about like 200 people or like a very niche sort of conversation, but rather engaging where power is, that is in the people.
Well, yeah, I mean, what that brings to my mind is what actually Tanya Plibersky, is that the right way to say, the shadow minister, said in her speech earlier. She said, if you want to really make change at the G20 level, you're talking to politicians, and politicians care about their constituencies. So if politicians care about their constituencies, the way to make change and the way for us to drive the message to the politicians is to mobilize the public, because they are their constituency. They're the ones that are going to affect them at the end of the day. I think to have our communique is great, to be able to bring to the G20 as a sort of get it into the agenda, but what's really going to put it on the politicians' agenda is their constituency and being able to be rooted at the grassroots level to such a level in the public consciousness that the politicians have no escape but to listen to our communique, because it's supported by the grassroots, it's supported by the people. And I think that's the only way we can really sort of make that connection that you're saying, and that connection comes being able to mobilize hundreds of thousands, millions of people, driving that message through. But that is by itself also not enough, as we have seen in Copenhagen. Who was in Copenhagen here in this audience at the climate talks? Let me see the hands. Who was there? Not many people. I'm surprised, because I thought we all were there. Because what happened at Copenhagen is we mobilized millions of people, and then the politicians failed us. And what happened then is all of those people went back to their communities and started working at the community level, because they realized that we can come together in millions, and that's huge power. But what we need to do really is to work at the grassroots level with our communities on the small changes that we can do where we are, and build those small changes up into the policy making, into the politicians, from the politicians' little constituency up to the prime ministers, which then come together at G20. So what we're doing here is a start, but that start needs to come together with the mobilization that we're going to do at the grassroots level.
Thank you. Now, would any one of the members like to add something,
Yes,
please?
if I could. For me, there's something that comes down to two extremes of behaviour or action. And one is pressure. Pressure, and it's forceful and it's big and it's broad and it's got lots and lots of people involved. But I think also there's another very valuable characteristic here in action that needs to be considered, and that's finesse. And so changing systems and engaging leaders in ways in which their ears and eyes are open and their mind is sitting in such a space that they can absorb information and think about how to respond accordingly actually requires, I think, both of those things at once. The Global Foundation operates on a very different system, and our methodology is very much about bringing a whole community-wide approach to some of these big issues, but doing so involving the leaders in those conversations. And I don't think either system can work without the other, quite frankly, because you need to mobilise the population to build the pressure, which builds the publicity and actually does address sort of the big system. But at the end of the day, and again coming back to my earlier point, we're actually dealing with people, and people respond in very different ways to each other, regardless of what job they happen to hold at the time. And so I think the two of those things working together, one which needs to be very loud and very noisy and very much about mobilising communities, but there are processes going on all the time on some of these issues involving the civil society, but civil society components that also have the capacity to be key influencers and game changers and I guess change agents in their own right are actually part of that process as well.
Thank you. Okay, any more questions? Please, microphone, put your hands up.
Well, Joseph, while that's happening, can I take a swing at that last question as well while we're getting this next one?
Sure.
Is my mic on? Okay. Look, my experience has always been the problem is them. Them is who isn't in the room at the moment. When you talk to them, they're fine, and the problem is everyone else that's not there. And I think part of the problem is it's how do we communicate messages upwards to people who are supposed to be governing but are more interested in politics, but also how do we take these kind of conversations and take them to the public? I mean, I read a lot of papers, and I've got to say I really struggle to understand what any of them are about, just because the language I think is so educated and lofty and academic. And I'm a smart guy, but I'm a simple guy, and I find I've got to keep translating what do they mean by narrative. You know, what do these things mean? And so trying to explain it to people who are in the problems and in the issues, I just think we need to bring the language down, not to simplify it, but to clarify it and to use the sort of language that people... And then we could talk to the convertible instead of just talking to the converted. That'd be my way of looking at it.
Thank you. That's the last question there. Okay.
I just wanted to thank everyone for revealing some of their personal experiences. It seems that many people that work in advocacy and campaigning come from similarly dysfunctional backgrounds, including myself. So thank you for sharing those positions. My name is Sam. I work with Friends of the Earth. We are incredibly grassroots orientated. We've recently had some very big wins with over 50 communities in Gippsland declaring themselves coal and coal seam gas free and forcing the Victorian government to hold a moratorium on coal seam gas fracking. That's very deep work that we've been doing for years with those communities. And what I would like to say as a member of one of the most poorest NGOs in Australia is I am only here at the goodwill of another NGO who bought my ticket and the tickets for the Torres Strait Island and First Nations elders that sit with me. So I would like to suggest to the C20 as a learning experience that this is rather inaccessible for grassroots communities. Nor has there been any capacity within these 2 days to invite the public, the grassroots community, in for a free session where they could be heard. So I think there are many problems. There are also problems when you hear people attending the forum criticising student protesters outside for annoying their day. So there are problems within our own sector and we need to be brave enough to face each other. But I'd like to ask, in terms of mobilising around the G20, I know Friends of the Earth is planning to participate in an alternative People's Summit and Convergence in Brisbane. I'm curious whether when you talk about mass mobilisation around the G20, are you talking about people coming out on the streets or are you talking about just more talking?
Are you asking this from any particular one?
Sorry, to the gentleman on the end, thank you.
Okay, Dr. Uiga.
My position is very clear on that. Of course, I'm talking about people on the street. I'm talking about people on the internet. Because I know the Friends of the Earth is using the internet quite effectively to mobilize change and to bring people together and to organize them and to also to talk and be able to get the message out to people as well. So I think right now the struggle, as we understand it, is everywhere, and the struggle is defined by the people, because you have your own local struggles And like you, there are many other people who are doing their own local struggles, and they get together and they organize around their issues, talking to their politicians, which is then going to also move up. So I'm not talking only about people in the streets. I'm talking about people in the communities. I'm talking about people on the internet. I'm talking about people everywhere. I'm talking about people in the room, in the G20. I'm talking about people in the alternative meeting. I'm talking about people directly engaging. I'm talking about realizing that we're a huge big rainbow of all colors and that we have to act together, and we're only beautiful when we're all together.
Thank you, Dr. Uygar. Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We run out of time. I would like you now to join me in thanking the members of our panel, Dr. Uygar, Jason, Caroline, and Heidi. Thank you, and thank you very much for the time that you dedicated for this session. Thank you.